Welcome to the Sooners 360 Recruiting Podcast, a podcast for OU recruiting fans by Sooners 360. Each week we catch you up on the latest in OU recruiting news and provide opinions and evaluations on all things OU football recruiting. I'm Chris Mason, lead recruiting analyst for Sooners 360. This podcast is now sponsored by Sooners 360 on Patreon. To support this podcast, please go to patreon.com/Sooners360-817 and click subscribe. It's only $2 a month, and there's also a free trial option. And I'm posting my recruiting content there on a regular basis. The link will also be in the podcast show notes. Also, this podcast is now part of the Believe podcast family. Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is episode 85, titled SEC Day, OU Goes 1 for 3. So we'll jump to the recruiting news, and as always, we start with commitment news. And as the title says, OU went 1 for 3, so we need to talk about the one player that OU did successfully get today. So that would be, as projected, Cortez Mills, the 6'1", about 175, 180 pounds wide receiver from Homestead, Florida. The recruiting process for Mills it's a little similar to Darius Afalava. Mills was able to take an unofficial visit to OU in the spring, made a serious connection with Emmett Jones. Emmett, obviously the OU recruiting coach on a heater right now. And then Cortez scheduled an official visit. He had several other schools that he was seriously considering: Nebraska, Clemson, Miami, LSU. He was rumored to be. Clemson had a big lead before his OU visit. His OU visit was 6/14. He visited the same weekend as Marcus Harris, based upon some of their social media information. Those guys kind of made a connection during their visit, and OU landed both wide receivers. So he did visit LSU after OU. I think he had a good visit to LSU, but if he had Clemson in the lead, I think, most people sort of feel like that Cortez found something very much like Clemson in Norman. So that was I think it came down to Clemson and Oklahoma. And I think Mills viewed, let's face it, the last 3 years, the Clemson offense has sort of fallen apart since Trevor Lawrence and the big receivers and Travis Etienne have left. They've just not been playing well. Cade Klubnik and DJU have not reached the kind of status that the prior Clemson quarterback run was on from about 2013 to 2020. Clemson had a string of really talented quarterbacks and had really good wide receivers. So I think OU pitched a lot of the culture off the field stuff similar to Clemson. And let's just be blunt, Marvin Mims had a really good season in the NFL last year. OU had a host of wide receivers that played really well. Drake Stoops, Andrew Anthony was well on his way to a really great season. Nick Anderson played really well. Jalil Farouk. I think he just viewed, and with him, and I think perhaps Emmett Jones just seemed like a better developer of wide receivers, and Emmett certainly has those credentials. So that's how OU won that recruiting battle. He's ranked as high as in the top 100 by Rivals. He's around 200 by 247. On3 has him ranked, right around 100. And most of the services have him ranked as a top 15 wide receiver in the country. I think he'll end up being probably a composite top 100 once everything shakes out. But that's sort of where his ranking is right now. On Rivals, he's the highest ranked OU verbal to date. So, obviously, this was a big pickup from that perspective. When I watch his film, it's not the same kind of film as Marcus Harris, but I kind of walk away with the same feeling that OU's getting a very complete wide receiver, someone who's very comfortable playing outside or playing in the slot. He's, I'm going to say he's only 6'1", but it looks Cortez seems to play bigger than that. He's have a pretty long wingspan. He's high pointing passes. Even when he's covered, he's not covered. Cortez is very comfortable going across the middle, making the tough catch, but he's also comfortable, doing a slant and go and heading down the field for a big play. And again, you just kind of get this sort of playmaker, all-round, polished wide receiver feel when you watch his film. In the same way, I got that same feeling watching Marcus Harris's film. So, which is kind of funny. We've got the left coast wide receiver, and now we have the right coast wide receiver. What does this mean to wide receiver recruiting? Well, this makes, so I've been saying OU signed 5 wide receivers last year. They didn't sign 5 last year. I said it on a couple of podcasts. I need to correct that. They did have 5 verbals at one point, but obviously Dozie Ezukama decommitted, so OU only signed 4 kids. Kearney, Carry-On, Daniels, and Zion Reagans. So OU's right now at 5 wide receivers, based upon an interview that he gave to the 247 Network, Colin Kennedy. Mills indicated that he verbally committed on his visit to the Sooner coaches. So they sort of knew he was coming. So they then were comfortable enough to take the verbal commitment from Manny Choice the next week. So OU's known 5 wide receivers was something that they were planning to do. Does it end up being 5 wide receivers? We'll see. Sometimes these things kind of just shake out. But overall, I would say that if you're talking about Elijah Thomas, Marcus Harris, and now Cortez Mills, you're talking about 3 very complete wide receivers, very comfortable playing outside or inside, giving you a lot of flexibility in how you're going to have a wide receiver game and play your wide receivers and what formations you're going to use your wide receivers in. And again, this is just more indication for Emmett Jones. Emmett Jones is just doing everything he needs to do in terms of being an elite wide receiver recruiting coach. I think those 3 guys are top 100 guys. I think Choice is about top 250, top 300, and Grayson Harris is probably 300, 350 range. It's interesting. You got the 3 versatile sort of multi-role guys, and then you've got the big receiver in Choice, and then you've got sort of the slot receiver in Harris. So I just really like this pickup for OU, and obviously the OU coaches could have stood pat. They didn't have to bring him in, but they felt comfortable enough to take the verbal commitments from both Harris and Mills on 6-14. So they obviously have a plan for how all this will work out. I think they knew they were getting Emmanuel Choice as well. So they've had a plan for this, and they're ready for it. So, but it does seem like, on a previous podcast, Caleb and I felt, both stated we felt like 5 wide receivers was too many. But, we'll see how this shakes out and what else, and we'll just see how everything plays out this year and this fall and see what happens, come signing day. So the other announcements didn't go OU's way. Micah Hennichor committed to SMU. I think it's his cousin is a defensive end from California who also committed to SMU. So they get to play together. I'm presuming that was pretty important to them. There's some question how hard OU was pushing for Mark Hennichor. I don't have any direct details on that, but Mark chose SMU, and that recruiting battle, I would say, is probably over unless something drastic happens. And then the defensive end that I think became much more important with the Max Granville situation was Smith Orogbo from the Houston area. It looked like it was an OU Texas battle. It looked like it was going back and forth. And then it started to leak out to some of the services last night that it was probably, last night early this morning, that it was probably going to be Texas. And he went ahead and verbal to Texas. Texas had taken some hits. Defensive wise, they've lost 2 defensive linemen. They thought they were getting 2 high profile guys. Looks like they're losing a cornerback perhaps to LSU. So, Texas needed a big win, and, Smith Orogbo is a fit for their scheme. They got the 2 big run stuffers inside, and then they've got 2 sort of stand up, defensive ends in their scheme. And I think, Orogbo fits that scheme if he can put on the weight and the size to stay on the field, which I think is the only question any Sooner fans had about recruiting him. And then finally, it's sort of OU adjacent in only the biggest expansive way in terms of recruiting. Lincoln Cure, the big tight end from Kansas, he verbal to K-State. And if he was choosing K-State after visiting A&M, Oregon, and who else, he was always going to K-State. So that's a little bit, it's disappointing OU didn't put up a better fight in this circumstance. Try and pull up a Michael Boganowski in this situation, who I thought was going to K-State, ended up choosing OU. But on some level, if this kid is going to stay home and go to K-State, he probably always was going to do that. So that's 2 big recruiting losses, or at least 2 losses from a potential class prediction. And what's OU's reaction to this? Now, the first one at linebacker, there's a fairly easy response here. OU has Marcus James at linebacker, and they'd like to add another linebacker. At least we think they would. The visits and offers they used in spring and in June would indicate that. So there is a linebacker who visited for the Barbecue U weekend. He's a very talented linebacker from Nebraska. His name's, we've talked about him before, is Christian Jones. So I think he's more of a, I know OU's inside linebackers are a little interchangeable, but Christian Jones looks like more of a will backer, more comfortable in space, more comfortable in coverage from his highlights than what I saw from Marka Henachor. He looked like he was primarily a Mike linebacker, but those things are perhaps a little more not quite as hard to terms as they used to be. But I still think Henachor and James, you'd have to move James to will, and I'm not sure he couldn't handle that. But I also think you could put 20 pounds on James, and he'll be a rangy, physical, super athlete Mike linebacker too. So Christian Jones, he's about 6'3", 215. He's highly ranked by several of the services. He's a top 100 player by a couple of the services. He visited Auburn. He's talking about, Nebraska's still floating around as an option. He's talking about taking a visit to Miami sometime in July. I don't know quite how he's going to pull that off during the dead period. So maybe that information's not quite right, or the dates aren't quite right on it. But for right now, he visited Oklahoma. It's very rare at this point in recruiting to get a verbal commit from somebody who hasn't taken an official visit or has an official visit coming up. So at linebacker, we do have a name. Could OU add other names? Sure. Could OU try and flip somebody this fall? Yeah, that's entirely possible. Could OU continue to hover around the Elijah Melendez recruiting and try and see if they could get him back for a football game, even though he's committed to Miami, and he said he's 100% committed. But you never know what's going on there. Miami's added another linebacker in their recruiting class, so they have several linebackers at this point. So I don't know. Maybe you could convince Elijah that OU just needs one guy and you're our guy. But again, and Elijah did visit officially, so you've got Jones and you've got Melendez So you've got two players that you can continue to recruit, one who's not committed and one who, maybe this recruiting battle's not over. We'll see. At defensive end, things are a little murkier. So obviously, there's all kinds of forecasts and predictions for Cade Pietrek to commit to OU. We haven't seen that commitment yet, and the forecasts are all there. He did visit K-State. K-State probably can push. They've had a good defensive history at defensive end recently. So they could probably push that. Cade certainly fits some of the defensive ends K-State's had recently. At Oklahoma, this is Caleb and I talked about whether Cade is an interior player or a defensive end, and I'm still inclined to think that maybe Cade's future, because he's 6'5", 260-ish right now, maybe under 260, maybe a little over. And watching his video, his high school highlights, he's making just so many plays from a defensive tackle spot. I just wonder if he ends up as part of the D-line class, the interior D-line class, which would make OU's defensive end class right now just Alex Shieldknight and CJ Nixon. So I kind of feel like OU needs another athletic, twitchy, pass rushing defensive end. That's why I thought they should push hard for Smith Orogbo, and why I think that's a little bit of a recruiting blow. However, there are no other defensive ends that have visited OU officially, and OU hasn't made a defensive end offer in a significant amount of time, not 2025. I don't think they've made a new offer there in maybe 2 months, 2.5 months. So if OU wants another defensive end, and I think they should grab one, that position is looking at a little bit of a reset. Todd Bates, Brent Venables, Zach Alley, and Miguel Chavis, obviously Miguel Chavis, I think kind of need to go back to the drawing board. And I'd like to see a couple of offers and some pushes for some folks, maybe from the Texas area, at the defensive end position. I think OU needs to continue stacking talent there. And I think another, twitchy, long-rangey defensive end with some, has some serious upside on the pass rushing potential would be a good fit. Obviously, OU's got players. We haven't seen what Wyatt Gilmore or Taylor Wine can bring to the picture. Obviously, Danny Okoye, along with them, just his freshman year, he's a little raw. So they got players. They do have some defensive ends beyond PJ, R. Mason Thomas, Ethan Downs and Caden Woolard. They've got some young guys below there, but we haven't seen much from them. And I'd like to see another athletic body in the defensive end group. So, but OU is up to 20 commits. They've got other players they need to add. So we'll see where all this sort of mix ends up. But losing Grant, if you could have gotten Granville, losing Orogbo would have been okay. But you lost both. I think you're just short one defensive end. So what's the other news around OU targets? And we're getting, like I said, we're at 20 verbal commitments. So there's not a lot of 25 names that we're really, really talking about. So the first announcement that should happen is on July 4th, Mekhi Williams-Lee, the defensive tackle from Atlanta, is supposed to announce. We haven't got like a final group image or a communication on his final 3 or 4. There's not any signs that indicate it will be OU. If I had to guess, I would say NC State. Beyond that, we do have some news about Amarian Robinson. He's definitely deciding on 7-6. We've started to see some forecasts. We've got a couple of OU forecasts from some OU writers. Then we got a big national writer, Chad Simmons, made a forecast. And then in the last 24 hours, we've got a forecast to OU from an Oregon recruiting writer. So OU seems to be having some momentum there. Amarian is obviously seems to be down to Oregon, OU, and Arkansas. So we'll see how that shakes out, but that decision's coming up on Saturday. Lamont Rogers of the offensive tackle 4 seems to be the only one that anyone's kind of referencing that we might be getting an announcement date soon. As I said, just like the last podcast I did, Brandon Drum on his podcast has seemed to be indicating from OU Insider, seems to be indicating that a decision date is coming relatively soon. Now, I don't know if that's going to be like a decision. He's going to be like post a decision date. He's going to post something soon about his decision date, and then decision date's going to be just a couple of days after that, or if he's going to say something like, my decision date's, July 15th. So I don't know what level of drama we're talking about here, or in terms of the waiting game we're talking about. We're talking about like, hey, I'm going to commit in 2 days, or hey, I'm going to commit in 2 weeks. But of the 4 of them, Ty Haywood included, he's the only one that we're getting kind of a sense that something is about to occur. So that's the news around OU targets. And again, like I said, we're getting down to a small number of folks to track here that have OU offers and that visited officially in June. For the most part, those folks are either committed to OU or committed elsewhere. For example, the 3 guys from 6-8, 2 of the 3 are committed. Darius Afalava to OU and Desan Brom to Oregon. And then 6-14, the undecided guys from that weekend are pretty much down to Floyd Picard. There was and then Michael Fasusi. And then, the following weekend, we're down to about Christian Jones, Andrew Babalola. And I think that's about it. Obviously, Elijah Melendez from the previous weekend recommitted to Miami. So, we're getting down to it. So I'd anticipate we might see in the next week or two a couple more names being thrown out there. Obviously, if OU gets Amarian Robinson, that closes out the secondary recruiting. Quarterback's been done for a while, but Wimberly and Robinson at safety are a great duo. The only floating thing out there would be if Jonah Williams decided to reconnect with OU and maybe take an official visit this fall. Again, we're not getting any hint from his camp that a decision is coming anytime soon. Of course, he could change that, and tomorrow we could get a post that he's going to decide August 15th or something like that. So that's really it from 2025 recruiting. It's been burning hot, but there's only so many. OU, to continue bad analogies, only has so many. There's only so many chairs left in this game of sort of recruiting musical chairs for 2025. They're at 20. I think 5 more would kind of make sense. So if I had to guess, if you had to sort of plug 5 in, I think the ideal grouping would be maybe Lamont Rogers, maybe another offensive lineman. So we'll go with Michael Fasusi here for lack of a better suggestion. That takes you to 22. Maybe Christian Jones, as you're able to convince him to be the next linebacker in the group. And then Amarian Robinson closes out safety. So you're at 24, if I have all my numbers right there. And then, that kind of leaves you, that's a 24-player class. A lot of people have been talking about that's as big a class as OU might have. So in theory, you could be done at 24, barring an addition. If I had to say, Chris, who would be the next guy that you would hope they add? And I think it would be Floyd Boucard at defensive tackle. And that would take you to 25. And then you'd be really in, do you need another defensive end? Is there a highly talented defensive end, tight end out there that wants to be a Sooner? I think those would be two spots you'd think about. Would you go for a 6 offensive lineman if a really talented player wanted to be added to the class? And I think, you'd have to debate who that player would be. But I think that would be a consideration. But that's potentially where OU's kind of heading. So the only other we're going to move to 2026 with just one small piece of news. OU verbal commitment, quarterback Jaden O'Neal for 2026 was at the recent Under Armour Future 50 event. And he apparently looked really, really good there. So there's a graphic that was floating around Twitter that was talking about the players there and ranked a top 10 group regardless of positions. It was just a mix of everybody. And O'Neal was the number 3 player out of that group. There's been other discussions that say that he was, and the top, their quarterback group there was loaded. It was Faison Brandon was there. Michigan's quarterback verbal, Hart was there. So this was not like lacking in QB talent. And the general consensus from some folks coming out of that is, I've heard some folks, 247 article indicate that they felt that O'Neal was the number 2 quarterback at the event. So we've been talking about him as a 5-star, maybe a top 5, top 4 quarterback in the country. The first event he's got to go to, be seen and judged again by his contemporaries in the class, he came out looking very good. So there's some highlights of him during 7-on-7 play. He has this great sidearm throw to elite wide receiver Chris Henry, who's probably top 5 in the class. He's going to Ohio State. His dad was an NFL wide receiver who played for West Virginia, but he appears to be tracking to Ohio State to play for Brian Hartline. But Jaden's off to a very strong start and proving that, he may be, there's a chance he could move into the territory of being the number 1 quarterback in this class. I don't think that's an impossible statement at all. So one last thing, Cortez Mills recently received an invite to one of the All-Star games, and I think he's going to be on the All-American game, the All-Star game that's on NBC. So a Sooner. So always nice when in those All-Star games have some OU players some OU verbals to watch, and Cortez Mills, I believe, it's going to be the NBC game, the All-American game. So that's all the news that we have for you. Please like and subscribe. Please subscribe to this podcast and don't forget to leave a rating. And again, please visit patreon.com/Sooners360817 to subscribe to support this podcast and also receive daily, recruiting updates and recruiting news. So thanks, everyone. Goodbye.